Arcane Mage is one of the most difficult specializations to master, but don't worry because in this beginner guide, I am going to teach you it with no information overload and help you get the ball rolling. In patch 10.2, Season 3 of Dragonflight. First up, this is the stat priority you're going to want to follow. The largest part of the pyramid is what you're going to want the most of, and therefore that is crit. Then mastery, then verse, and then haste. However, as a beginner, I would say not to worry too much about secondary stats and always just focus on upgrading your eye level for more intellect, which is going to be the biggest DPS increase overall for you. Now, before we actually get into the talents and rotation, etc., I want to show you some of the utilities and core cooldowns that are going to be really important in 10.2 for Arcane Mage. Now, these are your more sort of utility and defensive cooldowns I've got here. First being Ice Cold. This is your ice block that is going to have damage reduction and heal you. You've got greater invisibility, making you untargetable, losing all threat and reducing damage taken. Time Warp, of course, I'm sure we all know, is the mage's equivalent of Bloodlust or Heroism, and that is going to increase haste by 30% for the entire party. And Mirror Image, which is going to summon mirror images, reducing your damage taken and doing a tiny bit of damage to the target as well. Now let's look at the core cooldowns that are really going to make a difference and actually make up a very big part of the rotation. So just to explain, the way Arcane Mage works is we have, I would say, 3 phases of the rotation. And rather than thinking it of a rotation, think of it of 3 different phases. So we have a large burn phase, then we go into a sort of mini burn phase, and then we go into a reserve or conserve phase, which is your filler phase, I would almost call it. So the first one we've got up here at the top is going to be the 2 cooldowns that we're going to rely on to enter our big burn phase. So Evocation and Arcane Surge. When these 2 are off cooldown, it's time for a big burn phase. Evocation is going to increase your mana gen by 1500% and is also going to increase your intellect. And if you're thinking, what on earth, why do we need that much mana? Well, that's because Arcane Surge, our second one on the right at the top here, is actually going to spend all of your mana and do insane damage and increase your damage done. At the bottom here, these 2 smaller cooldowns are also going to make up part of our large burn phase, but when the top 2 are on cooldown and the bottom 2 are off cooldown, we can use the bottom 2 as our mini burn cooldowns. So just to clarify, you've used all 4 in your big burn, but in your smaller burn phase, when the top 2 are still on cooldown, because these are both at 1.5 minutes, these are only at like 30 seconds and 45 seconds, we can still use the bottom 2 on their own to form a mini burn phase. Radiant Spark is going to increase, and this is putting it really simply here for beginners, the Radiant Spark is going to increase the damage that your target takes, and Touch of the Magi is going to accumulate the damage done in a certain window and then explode all of that damage onto your target. This is the talent build that I would recommend here as a beginner. Don't worry too much about all of the little individual talents. I'm going to be talking about a few of them specifically, but generally I don't want you to get overwhelmed because this is going to be overwhelming as it is once we get into this rotation. But what I would say is that when you're more comfortable with the rotation I'm going to show you, go through your spell book and your talents and just look at all the different spells and talents that you have to see how it all fits together. Now, here we are in game, and there's a few things I'm going to tell you about before we get into the rotation. First off is this weak aura here. This is going to track all of your major cooldowns and buffs that we're going to be using, and I've put a link to this down in the description. There is also an import string for the talent tree down in the description as well. We've also got 3 things we're going to want to do before we start combat. If I move out of the way, we have down here Arcane Intellect, which most people watching this are probably already familiar with, but this is going to give you and your party 5% intellect for the next hour. We then have Conjure Mana Gem, and we're going to use this to conjure some Mana Gems. which you can see have appeared here at number 8 on my action bar. And that's to use those mana gems. The third and final one we're going to use is Arcane Familiar. And we're going to summon a familiar that attacks your enemies and increases your maximum mana by 10% for 1 hour. So we're going to apply that, and that's going to give us a 1 hour buff as well. So we're going to do those 3 things before we even think about going into combat. The way, like I said, that we have it is a major burn phase, a mini burn phase, and a filler phase. And this is the way I've set up my action bars here for you to follow in what I think is the easiest way possible. One other thing to say about this week aura is these. These are arcane charges here, and we're going to be generating and using these charges as we do our rotation. I'm not going to go too much into that, because in this beginner guide, I really want you to just kind of learn what you need to do and not go incredibly in depth into the why. We're going to go into the why to a certain extent, but not so incredibly that your head will explode is the idea here. So to start off, I'm going to go through the major burn phase, which is what you're going to have available at the start of the fight. If you are using Time Warp, this is when, of course, you're going to want to time your major burn phase as well, ideally. So first up here, we have Evocation. Increases your mana generation by 15%. We do also have a talent called Siphon Storm. Evocation grants one arcane charge, channels 50% faster, and while channeling, your intellect is increased by 2% every 0.4 seconds, and that effect will last 30 seconds, okay? So we're going to use Evocation, and you can see here on the weak aura that we have about 30 seconds of this buff, and that's the one that I just spoke about in the talent, and it is called Siphon Storm, and that is the one that is increasing our intellect. What we're then going to use is Arcane Orb. This is going to launch an Arcane Orb forward from your position, travelling up to 40 yards, dealing some damage to enemies it passes through, and every time it is dealing damage, it's going to grant an Arcane Charge, which again is this here, this extra resource on our weak aura. So we're going to cast this. I'm going to use it on the target dummy. And you can see here it's going to generate 3 arcane charges. What we're going to do next is use our Arcane Blast. You can see here that on the tooltip it says that we're going to blast the enemy, doing damage. And each arcane charge is going to increase the damage by a certain percent and mana cost by 100% and reduce the cast time. Remember, this is our arcane charges, and we're going to be generating some of those with our Arcane Orb. And then we're going to use our Arcane Blast. Remember, we are going to have the Evocation buff. So we're going to use that Arcane Blast. And what's going to happen is it's going to grant a proc on our Arcane Missiles, which is number 4. This is called Clear Casting. And it means that our next Arcane Missiles is going to cost no mana. When we get that proc, we're going to use it. And then that is going to, so using that proc is going to grant this buff here. That is called Never Precision. It's about to fall off, but that is actually going to increase the damage of our Arcane Blast. So just to recap there, we're going to use Arcane Blast, which is going to give us, it's a chance when we spend mana, by the way, that we get Clear Casting. That's going to give us the Clear Casting proc on our Arcane Missiles. We're going to use that, which is going to give us 2 buffs here. We're going to use 1 and 2 to use that up of our Arcane Blast. To recap the entire start, so Evocation, and then Arcane Orb. We're then going to use Arcane Blast, proccing Clear Casting, because we're using mana, on our Arcane Missiles, and then using these 2 stacks on our Arcane Blast. When this here gets to 17 seconds, we're then going to continue onto the next part of the rotation, okay? So we're going to use Evocation, Arcane Orb to generate those charges. We're then going to use Arcane Blast to proc Clear Casting on Arcane Missiles. We're then going to use the 2 stacks of Never Precision, which is these 2 here, which is granting extra damage on our Arcane Blasts. So we're going to use up those 2 stacks. Once the Storm Siphon buff, which would still be here if I wasn't talking so much, reaches 17 seconds, which remember is given to you by your Evocation. Once that reaches 17 seconds, we can stop using these 2 spells and move on to number 5, which is Radiant Spark. So we're going to use Radiant Spark. It's going to do some damage, and the target is going to take more damage from us. That's going to stack 4 times. So we're going to use Radiant Spark on the target, like this. And we're then going to immediately use Never Tempest. And this is going to place this on the target, dealing damage over 12 seconds and nearby enemies. And this is also increased by how many charges we have. So we're then going to use that. It's instant on the target. We're then going to immediately use our Arcane Surge, which is going to expend all of our current mana to annihilate our enemy and nearby enemies for damage based on the mana spent. So it's going to use all of our mana up. For the next 15 seconds, your mana regen is increased and your spell damage is increased. So we're then going to use that. We're then going to immediately use Mana Gem. And if you want to get a bit more technical with your Mana Gem, at this point is when you would use your trinkets or racial abilities that are further going to increase your DPS. And then this bit is going to be a tad complicated. We're immediately then going to use Arcane Barrage. And for each arcane charge, again, this is going to deal more and more damage and grant you a little bit of mana. I will say, however, this is going to absorb or use up these charges. And if you see here, when we use Arcane Barrage, can you see how it's traveling towards the target? Well, we also want to use our next spell, which is off the global cooldown. If you don't know what that means that, see when it goes round here, before we can, the cooldown before we can use our next spell, we can actually use Touch of the Magi while that is going down, while that little global cooldown is going down. And we want to actually apply Touch of the Magi before our Arcane Barrage hits the target. And if you're thinking that's ridiculously quick, wait 1 second, I'll explain. Touch of the Magi is going to apply it to the target, and that is going to accumulate 20% of the damage you deal to the target for 12 seconds. It's going to accumulate that damage for the next 12 seconds, and then it's going to explode for that amount of damage to all nearby enemies. What I have done here at number C, this is actually, even though it says Touch of the Magi, this is actually a 2-button macro that when I press it, is going to fire Arcane Barrage, and when I press it again, is going to apply Touch of the Magi. What I mean by that is this is a macro that you can just press and press again instantly, and it's going to do those 2 spells for you so that you're not having to click 2 different keybinds, one after the other as quick as you can. So what I would then do is take this off my action bar and take this off my action bar, and I'm going to now replace this here as one singular macro, okay? And I will put the macro description down below in the description. The last thing we're then going to want to do is use our Arcane Blast 3 times. So we've used our Touch of the Magi, and we're then going to use Arcane Blast 3 times. So 1, 2, and 3, okay? What I'm now going to do is show you that entire rotation actually working. And the reason for that is obviously I've shown it quite slowly, and we want to actually see it in action. Okay, so this is the entire burn phase. So channel evocation, that's giving us a Storm Siphon buff. We're going to launch that Arcane Orb to generate our charges. We're going to be using Arcane Blast and missiles on proc until we get to 17 seconds. Remember, we've got those 2 charges to use here. We're now at 17 seconds, where we're now going to use Radiant Spark, Never Tempest. We're going to use our Arcane Surge, immediately using our Mana Gem, and then we're going to do our Touch of the Magi, and then we are going to use 1, 2, and 3 Arcane Blasts. And what you can see here is that our Touch of the Magi is just falling off at the end of that. If you do have any time left at Touch of the Magi, like I just did then, you saw that Touch of the Magi was still up for a few seconds when I finished the rotation. What you can then do is this cooldown, Presence of Mind, causes your next 2 Arcane Blasts to be instant cast. You can use this and then go boom, boom on your Arcane Blasts to get 2 more in. And that is generally going to use up the time left on your Touch of the Magi. So that is the major burn phase. We're then going to go through the mini burn sequence, and this is basically a much more condensed version of the major burn. So when we have our major burn, the main things we're waiting for is Evocation and Arcane Surge, which are on a 1.5 minute cooldown each. However, our Radiant Spark and Touch of the Magi are on a 30 and 45 second cooldown. So basically what you're going to do is when your Radiant Spark and Touch of the Magi are off cooldown, we can actually carry on the mini burn or the burn just from this point onwards, I would say. So we're going to cast Radiant Spark, we're going to cast Never Tempest, and we won't have this, remember, so we're going to do our Barrage and Touch of the Magi, and then we're going to do this 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we can use E for instant ones. 1, 2, and you can see Touch of the Magi is coming off there, and it has gone. So the major burn, if you do it quick enough and properly, like I've shown you, it's going to work out near enough perfectly with the amount of time you have in that window, and same with the mini burn. In between all of that happening, when it's all on cooldown, so when all 4 are on cooldown, Evocation, Radiant Spark, Arcane Surge, and Touch of the Magi, you're going to have your Conserve Phase or Filler Phase. And basically, what we're going to do here is something we've already discussed. You know what we done near the start of the rotation, which was using our Arcane Blast to get the proc on our Arcane Missiles, which gives us this proc again on our Arcane Blast. We're going to use this as our main filler, okay? So just those 2 spells in that order, like that with those procs. That's going to be our main part of the filler. If your mana is really low and at below 10% mana at this point as well, what you can do is you can use your Arcane Barrage here on its own, and then you can use your Arcane Orb to recoup the charges. Because remember, those charges are going to get used up when we use Arcane Barrage, and we can throw an Arcane Orb to recoup those charges. And that is the filler phase. Now, by this point, your large burn phase should already be back up. So let's just go through the entire rotation. So Evocation to get this buff up here. And then, oops, this is still on cooldown. And then we're going to use our Arcane Orbs. Then we're going to wait, remember, until it's at 17 seconds on Storm Siphon here. If we get any cooldowns, you know, we're lucky. Okay, we didn't. We're going to use that there, a bit slow. Then we're going to use Radiant Spark, Never Tempest. Then we're going to use Arcane Surge. Then we're going to do our Touch of the Magi. Use 1, 2, and 3 on here. Okay, and now we're in our filler phase because we're waiting for these to come off cooldown. We're going to use those, and then we're going to do this here. And now we're on our filler phase. And we're basically now just waiting for Touch of the Magi to come back off cooldown. And see, look, now we're out of mana. We're going to use Arcane Barrage, and then we're going to use Arcane Orb. And now this is basically off cooldown, so we're going to do a mini burn of Radiant Spark, and then this one, and then this one twice. And then we're going to do Arcane Barrage 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to use our Peace of Mind. Again, we're out of mana, so we're going to use these 2. And then we're going to use our next 2 Arcane Barrages. And then again, and we're out of mana, and then we're going to do it again. And look, perfect timing. Evocation is now off cooldown, and we've got 20 seconds left on our Arcane Surge, and we're nearly ready to go back into that burn phase. One last thing that I did actually forget to show you is this one here, Shifting Power. You can use this at the last second when your Storm Siphon buff runs out. This one here that you have from Evocation, you can use this at the very end of it, which is Shifting Power, and that's going to reduce your cooldowns for you, and you should use that, yeah, at the end of that. So that's the whole rotation, how it works. I'm not the best at it, as you can see, but this is the most kind of basic form of this rotation. And if you follow this, you're going to have a really, really good time with it. It's so much fun once you learn how to do the different phases. And I would say that when you're more used to it, maybe look through Wowhead, etc., and really try and learn it to an even better degree and graduate from this beginner guide, because there is a lot more in-depth timings and stuff that you can do once you really get to grips with the build. But I hope this was useful. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. It is a very complex specialization, but once you get used to it, it can be incredibly, incredibly fun.